Okay, welcome everyone to episode 13 of the Manage to Win podcast. Today we have Bruce Eckfeldt, founder and CEO of Eckfeldt & Associates. He's a Gazelle scaling up business coach and author, speaker, and coaches on business development. His articles can be found in Inc. magazine, and he has two podcasts, one called Scaling Up Services and one called Thinking Outside the Bud. Bruce, thanks for being on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm excited for the conversation.
So are we. Can you tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Sure. Podcasts for me were, basically a strategy to investigate two areas that I was really interested and passionate about. So one, being service-based businesses. I founded a tech company back in 2002, 2003, and grew that, put it on the Inc. 500 list, went through that whole process of scaling a service company, and I found that there are some unique aspects about service companies. They tend to be sort of easy to start, but a little more difficult to scale. And so wanted to take that experience and collect experiences of others and create a podcast really focused on how to do that, how to successfully navigate that growth process for senior leaders in that space. So that's how we started the Scaling Up Services. Thinking Outside the Bud really came about through a couple of clients that I picked up over the years. As a business coach, working with them on strategy and strategy execution, helping them really kind of plot the course for how they were going to be successful. And it was just fascinating to me how dynamic and diverse that business kind of industry was. So everyone thinks about kind of the core, what we call grow chain of cultivating and processing and dispensing of cannabis, of marijuana products. But the fact is there's a whole industry around this, consulting services, packaging, legal services, real estate, and it really is a fascinating microcosm of an industry. Not only that, just the nature of cannabis, it has all sorts of social and political ramifications and issues that end up becoming really fascinating when you go to look at what do you do from a business point of view when you have a product that has such both historical and current kind of dynamics associated with it from a culture and social point of view. So I chose the podcast format to really be able to go out and talk to lots of different people. And we started with actually the medical side. We talked to some doctors and understanding really what is it from this kind of medical use point of view, effectiveness application. We've talked to real estate folks. We've talked to investors. We've talked to people that are actually dealing with the product. We've talked to other consultants. And it's a tool that I use to collect lots of different insights from the business side in the cannabis market and just creating insight that actually, I think there's a lot of things we've learned on the cannabis podcast that I've applied to lots of different companies just because it's such a dynamic, such a high growth industry. But that's how we kind of started the two podcasts, and I do them. We produce an episode a week for each of those. So I know your pain producing, but it's a labor of love, and I really enjoy it.
That's great. Yeah, we had a previous guest, Luis Alvarez of Alvarez Technology Group, talk about how, as an IT services company, they work with cannabis producers to help them with IT services, and how it's a totally different ballgame because there's a lot of regulations. They have to have 24/7 monitoring and cameras, and they kind of stepped in there and partnered with those companies to really help them do that. But it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
Lewis is down in the Salinas Valley, just outside of Monterey. And, they work with these huge growers of lettuce and, other things like that. And then all of a sudden the cannabis thing starts popping up due to legalization in California. So they were uniquely positioned to work with the growers because their techs actually go out in the field.
Yeah.
And do all this stuff. They're experts on all the technology, not only back in the IT closets or in the cloud, but also in all this technology that's happening out in the field.
Yeah. And I don't want to make this a cannabis podcast, but I'll tell you just a quick story that I think illustrates the fascinating part of this industry. One of my fairly recent guests, they were basically military and basically DEA agents who are using the technology that they would use to, from 10,000 feet, look down and see various infrared or basically patterns that they could detect to find like meth labs or underground bunkers in the military. Use this technology that they were applying it to crops, helping farmers figure out which stock of corn had, a mold on it and stuff. And they've taken it to cannabis. And so now they've gone from, shutting down cannabis farms to helping them grow cannabis using this technology they've developed. And it's that kind of application and business development and really transformation for a lot of these folks getting into this industry is part of the fascinating part of it. So anyway.
Well, I think the whole piece of growing the industry, the business, and then the political side, those are probably, I can see why you could fill weekly podcasts with stuff like that. But I'm curious, actually, because you have this unique knowledge on this industry, what about the business owner or even the hiring manager who's, we look at hiring somebody and do we want to worry, do they have, an alcohol issue or a cannabis issue or some type of issue? And then we also have that with existing employees where we have employees that, this person's not behaving right. There's something weird going on. So what are your thoughts or experiences on how cannabis is affecting the way we hire or we manage, our employees?
Yeah, it's actually, it's a fascinating question. I did an episode on this with an HR lawyer a while ago, and I'll send you the link at some point if I can remember which show it was. But and I think it's really one of the big sort of undiscussed issues related to cannabis because it affects everyone. This has nothing to do with whether you're a cannabis company. It's whether you're a company and whether you employ people. And if you're in company and you employ people, this is going to impact you, which is the policies that you have around basically cannabis use relative to your employment practices. And it's multifaceted in the sense that one of the problems, you can compare it to alcohol and you can say, hey, look, we have a policy as you can't be under the influence of alcohol while you're at work, period, right? Alcohol is legal. If you want to go drink on Friday night and you want to binge drink and you want to, have a bender weekend, that's fine. It's just Monday you need to show up capable of executing your job, right? And in fact, if you look at alcohol, it gets even more interesting because alcoholism is not something you can discriminate based on, right? So if I know that you're a member of AA, I can't deny you a job or not promote you for that reason. Essentially, it's a protected class or it's a protected condition, right? So now if I try to use this alcohol model for cannabis, it gets really complicated because one, I can't test. I can test whether you've used cannabis or not in the last 30 days. Because of the nature, it's a fat soluble drug that it stays in your body for a period of time. You have about 3 weeks, about 30 days, 3 weeks to be able to detect cannabis use. But I have no real good test for cannabis influence. So there's no real way to tell whether or not you're under the influence of cannabis. And depending on the product and stuff, the length of effectiveness or the length of influence is quite different. If I'm, smoking versus if I take an edible, those things will, kind of go through my system at different rates for different periods of time. So it's really tough as an employer. Now add to that the fact that I can be in a state. I can be in a state that has no legal medical use, but be on a neighboring state where an employee who lives in a state that has recreational use. Now, what do I do? Right? So the employee can legally use cannabis in their state at home, but now I'm dealing with this. Okay, now I need to figure out whether they're coming in to work under the influence. And to that, now if I'm a medically legal state, I've got some employees that may have a qualifying condition, which they've purchased a card and they've gone to a dispensary, they've used cannabis for something that actually, they might be going through chemotherapy. They might be, dealing with pretty severe medical conditions that they need, or, they have what the state has determined a legitimate use for the product, but now they're employees. And how do I deal with that? So as an employer, you really need to think about what is my position on this? And then what am I going to do about it? And generally what we're recommending and kind of the process, and I think I did an article for this for Inc. as well, is you kind of have to get ahead of this, and you need to really think about, what is your general drug policy? How do I put that policy up front? And then how do I have regular conversations with my employees to let them know and to discuss the nuances of this stuff? Because the problem is you can write a policy and there's all of these kind of gray area zones. But as an employer, I would say every employer in the United States needs to have some kind of sit down to think about what their policy is around cannabis use and get that in writing before they have any issues, before they have situations come up. It's going to help them tremendously.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point that it's not like issuing the policy and then never looking at it. This concept of introducing it, having the conversation, and then going back and having that conversation like quarterly, something like that, to keep people engaged in it. Because the other thing I would suggest as a consideration is, as a leader, you only observe so much of the behaviors of your people.
Yep.
And so just like a republic, like we live in America, we like to say we're a democracy, but we're really a republic. Mm-hmm. It comes down to the responsibility of the citizens. It comes down to the responsibility and the self-governance of employee to employee, because so much happens that you don't see. If one of your employees sees something, they either need to confront it or bring it up for somebody else to confront if it's a concern that something's going on, because you may not notice it. You'll see performance issues maybe, or unhappy clients or whatever it might be, but you may not know about it until it's too late and there's been a major cost.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, I mean, I kind of maybe tying it back to some of the other work I do, I think the challenge is particularly acute when you're growing quickly, and a fast growing company, these kind of things, I think leaders, founders, CEOs kind of get lulled into this sense that, well, they're there and they have relationships with everyone, and they don't, culture is just kind of a natural thing that happens. Well, that's okay when you're at, 25 people, but when you're at 250 people, you're not going to have that same kind of intuitive sense of what's going on. You're going to be operating through your senior leadership team, your policies, the people that you have in place that are executing on this stuff, and these kind of issues. That's where bad things happen, right? Where something happens and now it's coming to you because there's a blow up, or there's some exacerbated issue that really could have been and should have been solved through some just kind of better thinking through, like, how are we going to maintain, how are we going to define what's right and wrong, what is cultural, what's on culture, off culture, what's on value, off value, as we scale, so that people can self-regulate, can self-guide, rather than it happening from kind of the CEO or the people at the top, dictating it. It's got to be something that's just imbibed in the organization.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious on your opinion, based on all that you've done in this, on drug testing. I get asked in my work from time to time, should I drug test? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think the first thought I'd say is, if you're going to drug test, you got to drug test, meaning that you have to do it for everyone, and it has to be a standard policy. I think most people get into problems when it's implemented in an inconsistent way, either intentionally or unintentionally creating bias in the organization, right? So I guess philosophically, I'm fine with drug testing. I mean, I would suggest that you need to kind of look at the cost versus benefit of drug testing, and also realize that drug testing is not perfect. I mean, there's 1,000 ways to get around it if someone really wants to get around it. So I would say that it's not, I wouldn't be over reliant upon it, but I'd figure out why you want to do it, what is the process you're going to implement, and then making sure that you're consistent throughout that process. I mean, look, if you're drivers, you've got heavy machinery, or you've got, issues where, someone under the influence could, likely cause bodily harm to themselves or others, or to property and things like that, I think you have an obligation to have some kind of testing policy in place. But I think you also need to know that it is not perfect, and, implementing it on a broad scale has costs, both monetary and cultural. So you need to kind of decide, does it really work for you, and what are you going to get out of it?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key things too, is, you think, okay, I got to do drug testing. And like you alluded to before, THC stays in your system for up to 30 days. Whereas the alcoholic, I mean, that's a few hours and then it's out of their system.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's even worse. I mean, I can, I can have someone who, say takes a 5 milligram dose of THC in order to help them get to sleep and ease anxiety so they have a good night's sleep. So they show up nice and rested the next day and are highly productive. And I can have a guy who goes home, I won't gender bias, I'll have a person that goes home, and does 3 lines of Coke, and comes in the next day. And the guy with the THC, I'm going to be able to tell right away. The person that just, put, an ounce of Coke up their nose, like they would pass fine. I wouldn't be able to detect that. Right. So it's just kind of this, what is drug testing? I guess, testing is a way to detect, but it's not a way to really address the issue, I would say. I mean, I think if you really want to get into this issue, it's got to be a conversation. You've got to set up some norms and some values that people are going to self-regulate. I mean, people have to, I would, if you're really having a problem in that area, I might look back at your hiring process. I might look back at, kind of the cultural values that you've put in place. It's got to be a more holistic approach.
Well, and that really alludes to the concept that, okay, all right, we're going to do drug testing. What are we going to do if somebody doesn't pass?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the key thing, because if you're going to do it, somebo's not going to pass. What are you going to do about it?
Guaranteed. Well, the other one is you get, so say you've got, historical issues, right? So you find out that someone who's applying for a job, went through rehab. Okay, what does that mean? Does that automatically kick them out? Does someone is someone who's been through rehab more or less likely to be a high performer, right? On one hand, you could argue, well, they have a history of abuse, they're likely to have abuse again. The other hand, you can say, hey, well, this is someone who identified the problem, they went and they found a solution, and they went through a program, and they're committed to, improvement. So, would I rather have the employee that went through rehab and is now, been clean for 5 years, or do I want to take a gamble on somebody who didn't go through rehab, but maybe a regular user today?
Yeah.
These are questions, and these are the challenges of leadership, and these are the challenges of making decisions. Whether it's as a CEO or a hiring manager, or as a manager inside the company. I guess my general recommendation, or generally what I encourage people to do is kind of dig into the why a little bit. Like, what is your end goal, and is this going to help or hurt you, and is it the most efficient way to get there?
Yeah, and is it consistent with your values? As a company? Is it showing respect? Is it showing you value? I typically have the conversation and I say, unless you're going to drug test everybody, it's really just not worth it.
Yeah.
And also, it really comes down to the metrics. If you're tracking your metrics, if you're doing that piece, then you're going to know when something's going wrong.
Yeah.
And if your people are actually watching over each other, so anybody can call somebody else out at any level respectfully. That's really the thing to focus on. What they're doing in their personal life and how it spills over into work. You're going to see it in the performance metrics, and I don't think the drug testing is necessarily an effective way to go.
Yeah, I agree.
Don't worry about that. You probably don't have a good match.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the piece that I typically will get to when this conversation comes up. Look, if you're dealing with drivers or heavy machinery and things like that, I think you have a legal kind of responsibility to have some kind of thing in place, so heaven forbid something happens, that you've had a procedure. But for general employees, you're all you can really do is manage performance. I mean, you can't control what people think. You can't control what people do, outside the work environment, assuming they're behaving in a way that's acceptable and on culture, and they're performing to the level that you are expecting that person to perform in that role, then, I think that's about as good as you can do for the most part.
Have either of you ever encountered a time where you had an employee who was on drugs or was, behaving inappropriately that you had to deal with it?
I've got some stories. You want to go for it?
You go ahead. I have stories also, but
yeah, I guess so. I'll give two examples. I think one was where and this is always a challenge for companies. A company function, right? Where we're not doing business, but it's definitely a company sponsored event and someone, and there's alcohol involved, and someone, consumes too much, and does things that were unbecoming of a member of the company. And I think in that case, it really was, we had to take a hard look at the whole company, right? Because as much as it was, an individual who made some decisions that led to some unfortunate events, there wasn't. I think we realized it wasn't, intent, and this didn't seem like something that was going to be an ongoing issue. And also, we had a role. We made some decisions as a company to have an event with alcohol, and what it led to is a broader company discussion around what people's individuals' responsibilities were, not only at company events, but if they were with a client, things like that. So, and we came up with some guidelines, but I think, to our point earlier, we had some discussions. It was something that we talked about, and it was kind of the company came up with some general rules of thumb about, what appropriate behavior was, and what probably some good rules of thumb were around events like that. And we made some changes. And I would say it wasn't necessarily policy, like we didn't write it down and have people sign it. But I certainly felt like we had some discussion around an event that happened in an adult way, and there were some changes of behavior that ended up happening. So I think that was an example of kind of use in real-time company. I've had two employees who two people who applied for very senior level jobs, and in background checks came up there was essentially a conviction for use. And in both cases, there was a record. In one case, they told us about it beforehand. In the other case, they didn't. In both cases, we felt through conversation and through the nature of the role they were going to have and the discussion we had around them that they would be good in the role, and we hired both of them. They both ended up being very good employees I think both of them were with the company for more than 3 years. But it certainly, it gave us pause, in figuring out how do we want to deal with this. We actually ended up changing the way we did background checks to exclude those kind of issues. Because what we realized is that some of that was sort of a bias of records, and that we were probably finding records for certain types of people more likely than other types of people, and we felt like it was probably going to be an inappropriate bias using around hiring. So we really filtered down what we wanted to do background checks are, and we had the company that was doing our background checks only send us results based on very specific issues.
Well, it's interesting. I would take a different approach in that I would still want to get the information. As a matter of fact, I recommend with background checks that you do a civil court check.
Yeah.
Because you want to find out if they're suing their past employer, their neighbor, or vice versa, what type of people they are.
Yep.
I think that my experience has been, although I did hire one person who was sober for a while and was supposed to be sober, but his behavioral pattern later when I looked back on it showed he was not.
Yeah.
So I should have picked up on that. But in general, every other person I've worked with who's been involved in AA, who's been willing to be candid about it, it's always worked out well. So I think I would still have it in a background check.
Yeah.
But I would have it that I would look at it and say, okay, has the person discussed it with me? Have they been candid? Where are they? And how can we support them achieve this objective in their life and not let this be something that holds them back?
Yeah.
So, but I think it would help me as a leader to be aware of it. Just to kind of keep an eye out. Not that I'm going to tell anybody else what's going on.
Yep.
And also I tend to be more conservative in that with company events, I think it's easy in hindsight now, Bruce, I can say that. You can say this, that before the event, we'd have the discussion on, here's how we handle ourselves. But we've both been there where it wasn't before the event. I recommend as much as possible when people do company events, try to keep alcohol out of it.
Yeah.
Just because you have people on staff, particularly as you get bigger, where you don't know their background. You don't know their history. I mean, I know some people that have been sober for, 10 years. One of their techniques is they don't even use medicine that has alcohol in it. Other people can do that. Even sobriety, different people can handle different things.
Yeah.
And so it's a little different. I just try to keep it simple. And
yeah, I don't disagree. I think it's, I think to your point, you have to decide as a company, like, what are your values?
Yeah.
What's the kind of environment? What kind of experiences do you want to create? And yeah, I mean, I'm if a company is, if that's a concern or issue, I would say take it out. I'm certainly not. I do not, promote or suggest that somehow that adds to the success of a function. But I think it's thinking about it and having that conversation. Really, honestly, whatever you're going to do. I've seen that same thing happen where a company wants to go out and do like a ropes course or something like that. It's like, okay, well, like you need to figure out if you have people who are not as comfortable with the body or are not as physically fit. That's going to create a situation, and not that you can't do it, but you need to figure out, well, what is the experience going to be like for that person? Is that going to help or hinder, their connection to everyone else?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely agree. And it's similar when you're talking about the values piece. Another thing I'll talk to people when we're talking about business etiquette is I'll talk about, make a decision in your culture. Do you feel that using foul language, swearing, is okay in your culture or it's not? I've worked with some organizations where they have the foulest mouths ever, and they're just like, hey, this is who we are. People don't like it. They're not our clients. And other people say, well, I don't want to offend a client that way because, you probably experienced it, Bruce. They can swear like crazy, but you use one swear word and they're like, hey, that guy used foul language. I don't know whether we want to work with them. But I've actually had that happen with a client of mine.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I guess, I think so. I've I have a take on values that might be a little bit off center in that my definition of values, or when I'm working with somebody on core values, I really want to make sure that they represent a decision and a position, and like the foul language one for me, my test would be, well, first of all, I would say, is it really a value? Like, is it just something you like to do, or is it a value? Like, if you didn't do it, does it really change who you are or not? So there's kind of that discussion. Then I really move into this idea of for every value, I like to have a company identify an anti-value, right? And the anti-value is the thing they're willing to give up in order to live their value. And it has to be a trade-off. And the other rule around it is it has to be a trade-off that if I flip them around and I can give it to another company and still have it work, right? So if you say using foul language is a value of ours, I would say, okay, well, what is the thing you're willing to give up to get that? And can I flip it around and give it to somebody else? So I'll use an example and we can talk about the language one. So a classic one is transparency. So we want to be a really transparent organization. I say, okay, that's fine. What is it you're going to give up? And usually it's something around the lines of, privacy, something around, privacy around the organization. We say, okay, good. So you want to be transparent. That's important to you. And you're willing to give up privacy, right? Good. That's a trade-off. Now I can flip that and I can take another organization and we can say privacy is really important to us. And we're willing to give up transparency in order to get that. And I would say that works. Like I could legitimately see a company making that statement. And the idea there is that it immediately kicks out all of the table stakes values and all the values that are just kind of aspirational or lip service to ideals. And it says, look, a value is really about taking a stand on something. And so in that case, I would push the company and say, all right, what is the thing you're willing to give up? And if it's I'm trying to think of what you give up by swearing a lot.
Public perception of dignity and
maybe a G rating.
Yeah.
Something like that. I'd make them make a case for it, because by doing that, if they can come up with a good case, then it's clear to everyone why we're swearing. It's clear that that gets us something, and that gets us something to who we really are, and and we're willing to give this thing up. And so when that comes up, that's fine. We've already made that decision. We've already made that trade-off. And I'm not struggling with that whole, I lost that one client because of this and that. I was like, all right, well, that wasn't a client. It was a prospect, but they're not a client because they're not fitting that value. So this is a little bit of a rant on core values because it comes up a lot. And I think there's a lot of kind of anemic core value statements out there in a lot of companies. And I find that, pushing them and really making this trade-off, it forces some issues. And if they can't make a statement for it, then I'm saying it's not a value. It may be something you want to do, but it's not a value.
That's a good point. Jeff, you got questions?
Oh yeah, I was going to say that probably comes up a lot in your work with companies that are trying to scale. They're trying to figure out where, we started with this and now we're moving on to this, or we're trying to grow this.
Yeah.
Whatever that concoction was at the beginning usually has some changes and probably has some difficulties. Do you come across companies that are trying to grow and they often have to change their values because of the growth?
It's interesting. So the growth pushes companies to do things in new ways, right? So that they have a way of doing things. They have a recipe. They have a strategy that has worked for them. Typically to get them to that point, but usually I'm coming in because they're stuck. They're stuck in some way. And so in essence, what I'm doing is finding the constraint, finding the thing they're stuck at and figuring, okay, what is the new way we need to operate, new way we need to think, new way we need to behave to be able to get to the next level. And the value piece is typically, going from a much more sort of intuitive and sort of subculture understanding of value. And it just kind of happens because we're 25 people in an office and it just kind of naturally gets communicated, to being, something that has to be much more explicit. So as I grow, as the organizational dynamics get more complicated, I've got teams, I've got departments, I've got locations, I'm bringing on lots of new people, like all those things force values, core values and values to be much more explicit and something that I'm using as a tool to help grow the organization rather than something that just kind of is. So I would say that it's typically not changing the values. Typically, values are values are kind of there, and they're kind of the DNA of the company. Now, values can change as the people change. So if you're going to, if you do a merger or an acquisition, there's going to be, new chromosomes and stuff, mixing with that DNA. You need to figure out what the impact is. But I'm always careful about staying away from aspirational values. You can have all sorts of aspirational goals, but those are not values. Those are things you may want to achieve, and you need to kind of question whether or not that fits with who they are. But oftentimes it's expressing it and being very clear. And I like expressing values. I wouldn't necessarily put them on the wall. I like to see them in practice, what we call actions to live by. Having that discussion, making them clear is a key part of one of many kind of key parts of the growth process.
Yeah, it seems like values change as people and businesses grow. They start out as ideals that people aspire to, and then they change into guidelines to make sure that your employees and your workforce are embodying those values and living those out.
I think if they become explicit.
They become more explicit.
Yeah, I think they're, in my experience, they've always been there in some way, shape, or form. It's just they get teased out and identified as more of those kind of guidelines, heuristics. We talk about actions to live by. So I love examples. So having a company go through its history and talk about that time when something happened, and it's either a good example of the company living its values, or even a company not living its values. Of being able to, sometimes it's even a more powerful story to tell when the CEO sits down with a new group of employees and says, let me tell you about this one account that we had 5 years ago. And this is what happened, and this is what we did. And, we ended up in a lawsuit. We lost, $500,000. And as we looked at that, we realized we didn't live this core value, and that led to this outcome and this situation that we realized we didn't want to be in. Those kind of stories can often be very powerful in terms of examples of what our core values are and what they're not.
Did you experience this in your previous ventures? I mean, before you started Eckfeldt and Associates, you started a very successful services business, right?
Yeah, so we had a technology company. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, it's interesting because we came out of the lean agile space. So for us, it was a lot of this kind of interplay between what were the lean agile principles that we were embodying inside the company, because we were using a development methodology and a product development methodology that had its own sort of core values, and we needed to figure out how did we want to kind of adopt various pieces of those inside the business. I would say that it was very much an exploration. We had one of the things we did that was really powerful is we did a quarterly meeting where we took the whole company out for a full day once a quarter, and we had we did what we call an open space, but it was really a tool to kind of get at what were the issues going on at the time in the company and bubble them up to the surface and actually have conversations around. And that is where a lot of these core values kind of got articulated when we talked about like a vacation policy or a bonus policy, and figuring out how we were going to resolve that. Within that discussion, we were teasing out and kind of grappling with what our core values really were. So I think that was really powerful. And I think it's an ongoing discussion. I would say the values don't necessarily change, but your awareness of them and articulation of them, that constantly kind of evolves.
I'm curious about the 1 day a quarter. How did you kind of structure that gathering, and what day of the week did you typically do that on?
Interesting. I can't remember if we had a particular day of the week. I think so. Our business model was we had basically technology leaders and consultants that would go mostly on site to our client companies to help their teams with software development methodology, product development methodology. We did some coaching around business operations and things. But so one of the dynamics was a lot of our folks were actually not in the office. We had 50, 60 people, but we only had a handful of people in the office at a given time. Most of them were on site. So that one of the reasons we did the quarterly meeting is that we wanted us time. Like we wanted time for our people to be together and actually interact and talk. We experimented a little bit with format. We ended up discovering this idea of open space. I don't know if you've come across this, and it was used. A couple of folks in the Agile community kind of stumbled upon it in the late 90s, early 2000s. And it was originally used for really dealing with community and conflicts in communities. So they would go into communities that have had tragic events and things like that. And it was a way to gather a community and identify the issues and process the issues. And the Agile world was starting to use it to help with companies and teams. But the format of open space is that you basically start the meeting with a blank agenda, and you have meeting spaces and you have time slots, and you start the meeting by basically asking, what do people want to talk about? And people would write topics down on sheets of paper and put them on the floor or put them on a wall, and you'd have some discussion, and you gather the agenda from the people and what was top of mind. And then people would volunteer to lead a session. So I would say, hey, you know what? This is really interesting to me. I want to talk about this. I would take the paper, put it up onto a slot, put my name on it. And then we would basically run the day by going through those slots. And we had in an open space, you have what they call the law of 2 feet, which basically means if you find yourself either not contributing or not learning, you have 2 feet. You can go find somewhere where you can. So it was the idea is that people voted by showing up to these different sessions, and some sessions were well attended. Sometimes I remember once or twice as CEO, I would put something down, I would put it on the wall, and I was the only one there. And that was okay. And I had an hour to think through this issue, for myself. But it was a very cathartic process for the business to kind of go through and figure out what the issues were. And we had some really important issues come out of that meeting, and ideas that I'm not sure if just the leadership team sat down and said, oh, what are the issues we need to address? I'm not sure we would have come up with some of those things.
It sounds like a process ripe for an April Fool's joke.
Yeah. I don't think we ever did it on April Fool's, but yes. But like I said, the other reason we did it is because we wanted just time. We wanted time to be with our people and to kind of develop our culture. So, that was kind of unique to our situation. I know a lot of companies have that. Certainly I do a lot of this with I've got a couple of clients who are distributed leadership teams. So like CFOs in London, the CTOs in Medellin, and the chief revenue officer is in Palo Alto. So it's like, okay, so how do we, what is one of the things we need to do to be an effective team? Well, we have to spend time together. Let's get together once a quarter and spend 2 days and actually, go through these issues that I know we could do via Skype and we could do video, but there's something about spending physical time together that is really important.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that comes out with that open table, is that what you called it? Open table?
Open space.
Open space. I didn't think I had it right. Open table is when you're booking a restaurant.
Exactly.
That's like,
that's after the open space, then you use open table.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I like it. So, but the open space, the other thing is it reinforces you value the employees, you value each other, you're giving them a forum to be heard. As you said, it's an open agenda. They can talk about anything. This is bugging me, or this is something I think we're missing, or this is something they're good, we want to take further. Anybody can talk about anything.
And it is, so I recommend this a lot to the teams, the leadership teams that I work with. And a lot of them kind of get a little scared. They're like, really? Like anything? I'm like, yeah, anything they want, they can put on the table. Yeah. And we had things come up. It's like, well, we want more vacation time. I'm like, okay, happy to talk about it. And in the discussion, it's got to be, all right, well, look, this is how we make money. Right. And if we're going to give everyone another 2 weeks of vacation, that's, that essentially costs us X amount of dollars in revenue. So what do we want to do with that? Right. Because this is an open space, right? Like this is not like, we're going to discuss this. We're not going to, this isn't just, we hear all the grievances and then we've got to go off and deal with them separately. We're going to get into it, and so I think it does, there is some kind of, willingness to engage in open discussion and have constructive conflict and stuff that I would, recommend that you develop before you really do this. But it's powerful. Like when you really get into that level and be able to have those conversations with basically anyone in the company. And honestly, leaders, I think, are far more worried than they actually need to be. Most times, even when something like that comes up, employees get that. And they're willing to have discussions. Actually, we did implement, I think it came out of I'm going to say it came out of the open space because it makes a good story, but I can't remember if it really did or not. This might be apocryphal, but we had a policy where you could trade off salary for vacation. So we had a formula based on where you are in the organization. If you wanted another week's of vacation, we would adjust your comp, right? And so we said, look, fine. You want more vacation. Some people want more vacation. Some people don't. Here's the formula. You just let us know at the beginning of the quarter so we can plan. And you tell us what are you taking? Are you going to take an extra week this quarter or not? And so, and the being willing to have that conversation and being willing to have those kind of experiments and run those kind of policies and see if they work is huge for culture and huge for employee engagement. I mean, the level of commitment that we had from our people was quite exceptional.
Yeah, no, it'd be phenomenal. And the beauty about that is I assume you set or reminded people of the ground rules going into the open discussions, mm-hmm. And then leaders just have to be prepared. It's not a no, like you bring up with the vacation thing. It's like, okay, well, you've got that objective. I respect that. No problem. Here's the need of the company. How do we balance the two? Let's talk about that. I mean, think about politics today if they handled issues that way, right? It'd be a totally different environment if we had some civility back in there.
Yeah. One of my favorite ground rules, and we use it in open space. I use it really with all of my meetings. Pretty much all of my meetings, is the ground rule of yes and. So you can't say no, but however. The only words you can say are yes and. So everything's got to build. So if you had the vacation thing, I would say yes, and we need to figure out how we still make our revenue, or that we're still profitable, right? So it's never negating what they've said or the idea that they have. It's just adding another idea, which now sets up, okay, now we've got something to talk about.
Yeah. And basically in that environment, you're saying yes to the person more than yes to the request.
Yeah.
By having
yes to discuss.
And it's sincere.
Absolutely.
You're not playing a game. You're not being manipulative. It's like, okay, I can do that. I mean, but yes. And how do we resolve this? Yeah, I can see that. I don't know whether it'd be a struggle to get over saying yes, but
and it's
different conjunction.
part of it, it's fun because by setting up that ground rule, people have to start policing each other. Yeah. Right. So they start figuring out, like, if someone says it, they're like, yes, and now they're doing it to each other. And it's no longer sort of me as coach or facilitator trying to get this is their ground rule.
Well, one of my favorite stories is this was, 30 years ago, at least, maybe more. There was a nonprofit locally here that had turned into Toxic City. The founder his ego had gotten out of control. The board meetings were lasting till maybe 1 o'clock in the morning. Very nasty, totally against the values of the organization. And this guy, who was like number 3 in Fireman's Fund Insurance executive, was asked to come in and be, chairman of the board, which he accepted. And he started his first meeting by saying, okay, I have 2 rules. First of all, thank you for, electing me chairman.
Yeah.
I have 2 rules. Number 1, these meetings are over at 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
And if you're mid-sentence, it's over at 10 o'clock. So please try not to repeat each other.
Yeah.
And number 2, before you can say anything negative, you have to say 3 things positive. And then he enforced that. And literally it was weeks, if not immediately, the whole board shifted.
Yeah.
And the whole, the way they interacted, the way they treated each other, and eventually exposed that the founder was, doing some things that were not proper, and got him out of there and had to rebuild. But, it's just a totally different atmosphere by having some ground rules that showed respect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some
I agree. I think it's one of the, I would say it's one of the core things I do as a coach and working with these teams. Is just, and it's not even like, I have my suggested ground rules, but the first ground rule I put in place is that, we're not going to use any ground rule that not everyone agrees to. So we go through a process of, okay, what's the ground rule? Does everyone agree to this? Is anyone not able to agree to this? What do we need to modify? So we've got real enrollment commitment to it. And it's not just, here are the ground rules everyone follow. These are the ground rules we've agreed to. Like, we had a process, and everyone had a chance to be able to say, no, I don't want that ground rule. So now when we have a ground rule that says you can't look at your phone during the meeting, like, you've agreed to this. Like, this isn't, an external force coming in and think, like, this was, we talked about it, right? So it's a much easier way, and it completely changes the dynamic if you get that right.
I like that ground rule.
Oh yeah. That's yeah.
Too many people. So Bruce, with these open space meetings, I imagine, can you do these company-wide and also in separate departments?
Yeah, you certainly could. I mean, it is basically just a format for how to construct an agenda and then how to run a day. I would say it's particularly effective, or it's particularly dynamic, when you're bringing groups of people with pretty different views and mindsets and lists of issues, because you tend to get you tend to see kind of what's common, and you tend to kind of get the nuance out of what's going on. There's a different meeting we run, what we call Kaizen meetings, which are really process improvement meetings. I suggest that most teams, regardless of the type of team, but most teams run at least one a week, half an hour, where you sit down, you take a step back, and you say, okay, what's working, what's not, what do we want to change next week? And it's really just this culture of continuous improvement. So the open spaces are kind of in that category, but a slightly different kind of level and a different dynamic. Like I said, originally the open space stuff was done around communities, and they would bring 500 people together, and they would have open space meetings, in communities to do this. So it's been used. I've been part of several at conferences where there are hundreds of people involved. So it's really fascinating there. Certainly companies, particularly companies that have groups that don't normally interact, getting them, using this as a tool to kind of get them talking together is a great one. You could certainly do it in the departments. I would probably look more at the Kaizen process or the Kaizen meeting format first, because that's a little bit more of how does that department think about what they're doing and how to get better.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking about different companies I've worked in and how some things could be brought up in an open space meeting that really pertain just to the individual group, that person's individual group, whether it's finances or sales. And then they can deal with it in that. And you don't necessarily want to bring those issues into a big open space meeting with the whole company.
It's a good point. I would say my experience is that the ones that really are just the department naturally kind of filter out because people, any idea is a valid idea to start with, but it has to kind of go through a voting process or a selection process. So somebody has to be willing to stand up and champion it. And there's a little bit of you talk about it. Like, is this something that we really want to invest one of our boxes, one of our slots in. So there's a little bit of that. The other thing is that I'm always surprised. I'm always surprised that, finance thinks this is just a finance issue, but once you get a couple, you can have some people that show up and start making some points that are really, really interesting, and how lots of different parts of the organization will affect, particularly when you have a organization that is, there's a lot of interplay between things. How people sort of see the impacts and where ideas come from. I mean, you can get some crazy good ideas from people that you would have no initial thought that they would have, insight around a particular topic, but you never know.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bruce, I think this has been great. I think we can wrap it up. Unless, Dad, you have any further questions for Bruce, or Bruce, if there's anything further you want to talk about?
No, I think I could probably talk to Bruce all day. So
yeah, exactly.
I think you could.
Yeah. So,
well, we can schedule another podcast episode in the future. Bruce, we'd love to have you back on. How can people get in touch with you and learn more about you and what you do?
Sure. Well, if you're interested in me as coach and the work that I do with leadership teams and sort of the organizational growth side of things, eckfeldt.com is my website, and I've got newsletters and case studies and all that kind of stuff on there. You mentioned the two podcasts. So scalingupservices.com has all the episodes for that podcast is all about how to scale service-based businesses. And then Thinking Outside the Bud is the cannabis podcast. And each of those have 50 plus episodes with all sorts of different folks, talking about all sorts of interesting things. So you can check those out. Those are also available on iTunes and all the other podcast sites, so you can look them up.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate it.
Likewise.